إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله أحسن هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. قال سبحانه وتعالى في القرآن الكريم بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ربنا ظلمنا أنفسنا وإن لم تغفر لنا وترحمنا لنكونن من الخاسرين. وقال تعالى لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين. وقال تعالى أني مسني الضر وأنت أرحم الراحمين. وقال تعالى ونادى نوح ربه فقال رب إن بني من أهلي وإن وعدك الحق وأنت أحكم الحاكمين. وقال تعالى ربنا اغفر لي ولوالدي وللمؤمنين يوم يقوم الحساب. وقال تعالى رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. My dear brothers and sisters, I'd like to start off by introducing the specific verses I recited to begin this khutbah. Allah in the Quran talks about, He gives us several stories throughout the Quran where He directly talks to people of all kinds. So there's no specific type of people the Quran is for, right? And we look at this in the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, and we look at all his instances he went through and the reasons why the Quran was revealed, and we looked at every single type of person. The Quran was relevant to them. Whether it was someone who was young, whether it's someone who was just entering Islam, whether it was someone who was, like the Sahaba, like Omar or Abu Bakr, the people who were the closest to him. In all cases, the Quran was relevant to them in every single instance. And it was said that Aisha anha, whenever she was going through any difficulty or any struggle, she would always turn to the Quran. The Quran was for her something to go to. The story of Ifk, she was in the deepest of almost in a state of depression because the whole society had turned against her. But she went to the Quran. And we look at the example of the different surahs that were revealed in the Quran. And the Prophet ﷺ, how Allah reveals specific surahs just to console the Prophet ﷺ. We look at the example of Surah Yusuf, of Surah Maryum, of Surah Ibrahim, all these surahs that were revealed towards the end of the Hijrah, before the Hijrah, because these were times that were very difficult. So Allah had to console the people, the Muslims at the time. So He reveals these specific surahs. And the verses that were cited in the beginning, they were all du'as of the messengers of Allah. And we look how in the end, inshallah, we'll talk about how the similarities between all these different du'as that the messengers made, and we look how every single instance they went through, they made du'a, right? They turned to Allah in all instances. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, أَشَدُّ النَّاسِ بَلَاءً الْأَنْبِيَاءُ ثُمَّ الصَّالِحُونَ الْأَمْثَلُ فَالْأَمْثَلُ. Right? The people who were tested the most were the ones who were the messengers of Allah. And then after that were the people who were righteous, and after that, and so forth. So we look at the example of each of these messengers who made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their difficulty. And we'll look at how it is relevant to our lives as well. And we look at the example of Adam and Hawa, Prophet Adam alayhi salam. They were in a state of, they were in Jannah, and Allah told them, don't go near this tree. If you go near this tree, then there will be certain circumstances. So what happened was Shaitan came to them and whispered to them, and and they slipped and they made a mistake and they ate from the tree. And so what the punishment was that they were sent to this dunya. However, we look at the two contrasts between the two types of people, right? Iblis, he made a mistake by disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what did he do? He was arrogant. He said he didn't accept the mistake he made. He continued to do, he's like, I will, instead of me asking Allah to forgive me, I will continue to do that same mistake over and over again. But we look at the example of Adam and Hawa, what did they do in this specific circumstance? They made a mistake, they slipped, and then they accepted. When they said in the Quran, رَبَّنَا ظَلَمْنَا, oh our Lord, we wronged ourselves, we did something wrong. And they're accepting the fact that they did something wrong. And so what they did with this specific trial, this specific test that they were tested with, they said, رَبَّنَا ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا وَإِن لَمْ تَغْفِرْ لَنَا. Right? So forgive us. If you don't forgive us, then we'll be from the losers. And so we look at this, how in our lives, whenever we come across a situation, to give you an example, many of us may be tested with certain. All of us, as humans, we sin, and we're all tested with a certain difficulty. But whether it's someone who's an alcoholic, let's say someone is on a business trip and he's addicted to alcohol, right? He will be rewarded for something let's say that there was alcohol in his hotel room, he will be rewarded for not drinking this. However, if you're someone who has no trouble in preventing yourself from drinking alcohol, you won't, it's not something you're going to be rewarded for. This is something that's just, because you're not really, it's not really a trial for you. But what's difficult and what's a trial for you, this is something that's rewarding, that will be rewarding from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We look at the example of Ayyub alayhi salam. We look at the example of, forgive my mistake, we look at the example of Yunus alayhi salam. Right, Yunus alayhi salam, what happened in his story? He was, years and years he tried to give da'wah to his people, let his people know about La ilaha illallah. What happened afterwards, he gave up and he said that these people will not, it's like, if someone is not, let's say your sibling is not listening to you, or your friend of yours is not listening to you, and you just give up, you're like, you're not listening to me, forget you. Right? And this is what's the reaction Yunus alayhi salam did. So he said, forget these people, leave them, and he's like, I'm going to leave them. So he goes out on this journey on the ship, and what does Allah do to him? He drowns him, right? To keep a long story short, he's drowned and he's swallowed by a whale. And what happens is when he's inside this whale, we look at the similarity in our lives. How does this situation that Yunus alayhi salam is going through? He was in the darkest of corners. Like, imagine yourself if you're inside a whale. If I was, honestly, if any of us were in a whale, we'd probably give up. We'd probably say we're probably going to die in the next few minutes. Right? But Yunus alayhi salam had hope. He had hope. In the Quran, in the verse, it says, he was in darkness, right? And darkness could be darkness of, the actual darkness of the whale. It was also the darkness of, the sin he had just wronged himself. Right? He said that, he left his people. So what did he say? He says, أَنِّي مَسَّنِيَ الضُّرُّ وَأَنْتَ أَرْحَمُ الرَّاحِمِينَ. He says, I have wronged myself. He says, have mercy on me. Right? So he actually says, La ilaha illa anta subhanaka inni kuntu min al-zalimin. Right? He says, Lord, I have been afflicted with hardships. Have mercy on me, and the most merciful of those who have mercy on me. Right? So in this situation, Yunus alayhi salam, he was going through such difficulty and he was in such darkness. He asked Allah that, I've wronged myself, so forgive me for my, forgive me for what I've done, and you're the one who are the most merciful. When we look at the example of Ayyub alayhi salam. Ayyub alayhi salam, he was given wealth, and he was given such amazing health and abundant full of children and gardens. He had a big mansion of his house, and he was given so much wealth that to the point where people would come to him for asking him for help in their needs. And subhanAllah, what happens in this story, we look at the example of Ayyub alayhi salam. He was tested by Allah because Iblis was saying that if you take away this from him, he's he'll actually disobey you. He won't pray like he prays usually. So what does Allah do? He takes away his wealth, he takes away his health, and he also takes all his children away from him. Right? And we look at the example in our lives. Many of us have gone through a difficulty. Many of us may have our son or our daughter has passed away, or maybe our father has passed away, and maybe Allah has tested us with a certain disease that we cannot, that's so difficult on us and maybe in our families, or maybe we were so rich at one point and Allah takes away everything from us. Maybe so any of these situations could be inflicted upon us. But Ayyub alayhi salam, every single one of these was afflicted upon him. He was tested with every single one. And even then, he says, and it's narrated in Ibn Kathir, where Yazid ibn Masaywa, he said that Ayyub alayhi salam said, I praise you, the Lord of the world, who bestowed kindness upon me and gave me wealth and children, and there was no corner in my heart that there was filled with attachment to these worldly things. Then you took all that away from me and emptied my heart, and there is nothing to stand between me and you. There was a saying of a past scholar of Islam who says that the money was never in my heart. Money should never be in your heart, it should always be in your pockets. Right? So what that means is that if it's something that's in your heart, you're always going to be attached to it. And if it's taken away from you, you'll be in a state of depression. But if it's been taken away from your pocket, you'll still have that relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Ayyub alayhi salam, he still continued to worship Allah even after he was afflicted with this terrible disease, where people didn't want to come near him. Right? And we look at the example of Nuh alayhi salam. Nuh alayhi salam, he was also telling people about the message of Islam to his people. Right? He continued to give da'wah, and it is to the point where his own son did not even listen to him. Right? Where he tells his people, this flood is going to come. We need to make this ark, this ship. And he asks his family to come with him, and his son says, he pretty much rejects him. He says, I'm going to go to this mountain. It's more higher up there. It's going to be more safer. So I'm not going to listen to you. And we look at this example of how this son, he's not listening to his father. Right? We come across this situation in so many instances. Right? But even in this situation, he makes dua to Allah. He says, وَنَادَى نُوحُ رَبَّهُ فَقَالَ رَبِّ إِنَّ ابْنِي مِنْ أَهْلِي وَإِنَّ وَعْدَكَ الْحَقُّ وَأَنْتَ أَحْكَمُ الْحَاكِمِينَ. He says, and Nuh called to his Lord and said, my Lord, indeed my son is from my family, and indeed your promise is true, and you are the most just of judges. Right? He still felt this sympathy for his son. He still wanted his son to come with him. But what happened was, just like how we'll come to the example of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Or just like that, his son was also taken away with the people as well. So we look at the example of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Ibrahim alayhi salam, he had a father who was a mushrik, who was someone who worshipped idols. It's not even his father was someone who had done such and such wrong. He wasn't even a Muslim. And he goes to his father and he tells his father about this religion of his, and he tells him about this, and this is what he does. He tells him that this is the religion of Islam and this is the truth. And what happens after he broke the idols and he did all that, his father almost pretty much tells him to leave the country. He's like, leave us, leave our tribe alone, leave everyone, and to the point where he's completely abandoning his own son. Right? But even then, his own son talks to his father in a way where he says, Ya Abbasi, Ya Abbasi, Ya Abbasi, in a very, very soft tone, very soft word. So if we look at this example, many of us have fathers who may have done something wrong, or maybe there are people who completely, there are instances of times when I remember one of our teachers, he told us that there even in our society there are people who fathers were alcoholics, and they abused their children, and they abused their wives, right? And even then, and this is just a sin. We look at this example of Ibrahim alayhi salam's father. This is the worst of sins. Someone who is worshipping idols, is a mushrik. Even then, he shows respect and shows kindness to his own father. And Allah, He says in the Quran, He says, رَبَّنَا اغْفِرْ لِي وَلِوَالِدَيَّ وَلِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَوْمَ يَقُومُ الْحِسَابُ. He said, oh my Lord, forgive me and my parents and all the believers on the day when reckoning will take place. And we look at the final example of Musa alayhi salam. Musa alayhi salam was tested with speech. He was tested with speech. He was told by Allah, you need to go to Fir'aun. He says, you need to go to Fir'aun and tell him about this message that we've given you. And he says to Allah, he says, I got a problem with my speech. I can't really speak well. And he says to him, he says, I need some help. First he makes dua, then he asks for help from his brother. Right? And we look at this example, many of us are in situations where we feel that we're limited in our skill. So many of us may be blind, or maybe someone might be, struggling to, speak just like Musa said, or maybe someone is deaf, or maybe he's not good at performing a certain skill, right? In any example, we look at how Musa, one of the best people to ever walk on the face of this earth, he was still given this difficulty of speaking and speaking in a certain way. And subhanAllah, what does he do? He makes dua to Allah just like how every single messenger is making dua. They all turned to Allah whenever they went through a difficulty. Every single time, whenever they were going through a difficulty, they turned to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says, oh my Lord, he said, Rabbi shrah li sadri. He said, oh my Lord, open for my chest. So self-confidence, contentment, and ease my task for me, and make loose the knot from my tongue, and that they understand my speech, when he's referring to Qur'an. So there was actually an example. I was watching a TV show by the name of Travels with the Quran. There's a TV show by Imam and overseas. He does a show where he goes to different countries, and he to different halaqat or classes of Quran, tahfidh, where people are memorizing the Quran. And he just shows how amazing such young people memorize the Quran in different ways. So one of the shows, he comes across this blind kid in Egypt. He's a young kid, maybe 11, 12 years old. And subhanAllah, when I heard the words that came from his mouth, it was just mind-blowing, subhanAllah. He says, so what happened is first he actually explained how he had memorized the Quran at such a young age. He was maybe around 7, 8 years old. And he used to go 45 minutes just to travel to his teacher. And he would maybe learn 1 verse, 2 verses. And he was blind. This kid was blind, by the way. And he says, so the Imam, he asked this kid, he says, have you ever asked Allah to relieve you of this defect where he's blind? Have you asked Allah to forgive or to make you give your eyesight back? And he says something amazing. He says that I'm grateful and I praise Allah for Allah taking my eyesight. He says I never ask Allah to give my eyesight back, hoping that it will be a proof for me on the day of judgment, so that He would ease me of my punishment. Right? Like he was someone who was blind, right? Many of us go through difficulties of lowering our gaze. We all do. And he says that, I ask Allah to never even, remove my eyesight, because this is something that will be a reason for me maybe to enter Jannah, because I was able to, worship Allah in a way that was pleasing to Him. Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi ajma'in. In the Quran, Allah talks about a group of people in Jannah. Right? They will have a reunion in Jannah. There's a group of people who will have a reunion in Jannah. Very close friends. They'll come together, and Allah describes in Surah وَأَقْبَلَ بَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ يَتَسَاءَلُونَ. And He continues and He says, and He describes the character trait of these people. These people who, when they ask each other questions, they're like, how's it going? After a long time, they haven't seen each other. So this characteristic, and Allah talks about these people in Jannah. What is their characteristic? He talks about 2 characteristics they have. Right? So before that, He says that we're people who are always in a perpetual state of concern. We were always in concern. And then we were always people who used to make dua continuously. Right? People who used to make dua continuously. And in these 2 character traits, Allah describes that these people are the people of Jannah. So how did these people get to this point where they were always in a state of concern, right? Whether for themselves or their family or for the community, or whether it was for even their own self, as we said. So they used to continue to make dua. And with that said, I'd like to go over 5 different character traits, or 5 traits that you see that were common among all the messengers of Allah. And you see that this is something that even our Prophet ﷺ had told us to do in times of when we're making dua. So the first is that the message of Allah, so a way to increase our chances of accepting our dua is praising and glorifying Allah before you make dua. Right? And we look at the examples of all the messengers. If you notice that all of them, they all, say Rabbana, Rabbana, or La ilaha illa subhanaka. They're always praising Allah. They're always praising Him. Right? Just like, let's say there's someone who you want something from. Let's say, like, maybe you want to borrow money, or you want to borrow a certain car. And you tell them, you've always been good to me. You've never, you've never let me down. You've always been good to me. And so this is a way of, you're praising Allah in a way where you're saying, Allah, you're always good to me. You're always someone who's going to help me in all these situations. So this is a way of kind of asking Allah to increase our chances of accepting our dua. Number 2 is that they had full confidence in Allah in every time they made dua. We look at Yunus alayhi. We look at all these messengers when they were in darkness, right? Whether we're in a state of depression or you feel like we're all lonely, they had full confidence that Allah will accept their dua. Number 3 is that they show effort and they show urgency. So whenever they're making dua, they never stop. Right? There was actually a saying the pious predecessors used to say that they would become sad when their difficulties subsided, as they realized that they were more persistent in dua during the time of difficulty, thus strengthening their bond with their Creator. So that's what they're saying is that they never wanted difficulty to go away, because whenever they were in a state of difficulty, they always were making dua. They were always in a state of dua. Number 4 is humility and humbleness in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's showing Allah that that you have weaknesses. We all have weaknesses. We all have certain difficulties we're going through. And that's exactly what Adam and Hawa did. Right? They said, Rabbana zalamna. They recognized that there were people who have done wrong. And just like how the other messengers, they said that this is something that's wrong with us, or this is something we've done wrong. We ask you, Allah, to help us in the situation. And number 5, I'd like to end with this, is that they were always in a constant state of remembrance of Allah. And I'll end with a story, inshallah, a story of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And Imam Ahmad is one of the 4 great scholars of Islam. He actually lived in a time where there was no TV, there was no CNN, there was no any of these kind of newscasts where people you could tell who is who, right? So let's say someone like a LeBron James, right? If we were to see him, we'd want to take a picture with him, right? Because we know who he is. But someone like Imam Ahmad, he was known to the entire subcontinent, wherever the Muslim Ummah was. Everyone knew him. Everyone knew him. But they didn't know how. They couldn't recognize the face. So because they'd never seen him before, they knew about him, but they couldn't recognize his face. So there was a story that he actually one time he had traveled afar, to study one hadith, and he comes across this masjid. He didn't have a place to stay, so he decides to sleep outside this masjid. And he's sleeping on the door of this masjid, and the keeper of the masjid, he comes and he says, "You can't sleep here." And he says, "Get out of here." He's like, shoot, just like someone who was on the street. He's like, get out of here. The man didn't know who Imam Ahmad was. If he had known, he would never have done this. But he says, get your stuff and get out of here. So what he does is he goes down the steps and he goes outside the gate a little closer to the street, and he starts sleeping on the street. And the keeper, he comes again, and he tells him, he's like, I just told you cannot stay here, you need to leave. So he tells him, he's like, get out of this place, you can't sleep here, it's not allowed. So what happens is there was actually a bakery right across the street, and this man was here in the early morning, so this was like before Fajr. And he comes and he sees this man on the road, and he says to him, you can stay in my bakery for the night while I'm doing my work, because I'm just going to be working for the night, and you can stay in my bakery. So the man, he allows Imam Ahmad to come into his bakery, and this man didn't know who Imam Ahmad was either. So what happens is, as he's making his Imam Ahmad, he's on the side, he's laying down, just getting some rest. He notices that this man, while he's working, he's always in the state of he heard him saying, he was saying something, and he heard him continuously he's making dhikr. He was saying Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah, Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah. He was always in this state of remembrance of Allah. And so what happens is, Imam Ahmad's like, man, this guy's like, he's always making dhikr. He's like, this is something very interesting. I've never seen something like this. And he asked him, he's like, what is, like, you do this all the time. Is there something that has happened to your life that, that Allah has helped you in these situations? And he actually says, yes. He's like, every time I make dua, it's mustajab, meaning it's accepted. Every time I ask Allah for something, it's been accepted. He's like, but there's been one dua that has never been accepted. He says that I make dua every day to meet Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And subhanAllah, Imam Ahmad, he got into tears. He started to cry. He says, that Allah dragged me from the street into your bakery, like just because of this is the power of dua. Right? This is someone who was always in a state of concern for himself, or he was always in a state of dhikr, of remembrance of Allah. So we ask Allah to make us among those who make dua and make us among the people of Jannah. And we also ask Allah to ease the difficulty of all the Muslims who are struggling, whether it's with disease, or whether it's with wealth, or whether it's a loss in a family, or even a difficulty with their parents or even their children. We ask Allah to help those Muslims who are suffering in Burma, in Palestine, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in Syria, in Egypt, and all those, in every country. إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى واليتامى والمساكين والجار ذي القربى واليتامى والمساكين